Hey everyone! Thank you for joining us for today's session. Last week, I shared some behavioral characteristics of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also commonly known as ADHD. In today's session, I plan to share some strategies that will be particularly useful for students returning to school who struggle with those symptoms and behaviors related to ADHD. Putting these tips in place will help build the foundation for a successful school year. The first tip I want to share is encourage you to identify the areas of learning that are affected by ADHD. So if you're a parent, you may have to help your student identify these areas. So it can be very overwhelming for an individual who struggles with ADHD or a learning disorder. Like, for instance, if a teacher is standing in front of the class lecturing for more than an hour and then begins asking questions, the student may become frustrated and think, how does everyone else know the answer to these questions? Or when they're taking a quiz or a test, they may be thinking, well, why is it taking me so long to finish this test or quiz when everybody else is already turning in their work? This type of thinking can quickly transform into negative self-talk and negative feelings of self-worth when left misunderstood. So when it comes to any disorder, knowledge or education is key. So if you do have a student, or if your child is a student who struggles with ADHD, this is a good place to start with these discussions surrounding areas of learning where they have the most difficulty. So let me give you some examples. If your child is becomes easily distracted or has difficulty staying on task, getting together to study with a group of friends may not be the best idea or the best learning environment for your child. So it'll be a great idea up front to have this conversation with your child and go ahead and create or establish some kind of study area like we discussed in our back to school wellness session. So just setting those rules or expectations up front so they're aware of areas where they need some additional support. Another example of an area of learning that might be affected is just becoming overwhelmed with large projects. So here it's a great idea at the beginning of the school year to take a look at the syllabus and see what large projects there are and go ahead and break those into smaller, more manageable steps so that you or your child will not be as overwhelmed just by looking at the large project, and it might seem a little more doable or manageable for your student. And the last one is, if you or your child are aware of an area, a particular subject area where they typically have difficulty learning, go ahead and line up some tutoring or reach out to a teacher or school counselor and see what kind of additional supports there are that you could put in place for your student up front, and not wait until they fall behind if you or your student know that this is an area where they typically have trouble. So the next strategy is all about organization. An individual who struggles with any symptoms or behaviors related to ADHD typically has a lot of trouble in this area. So the best thing to do, especially before the start of a new school year, is just to get organized and be proactive in that area. And that could be something different for everybody. There's lots of different ways to get organized. For instance, you can use external tools like calendars, even apps to organize the things that you need to do or remember, planners, phone reminders, things like that, those external tools. But there's also other things that you can do, and I wouldn't recommend trying a bunch of stuff all at once if you don't already know what works for you. But think about things maybe that you have tried in the past that have worked, and things that you've tried in the past that haven't worked for you, and kind of go from there as a starting point. Some other ideas here would be to write things down. That always helps me. I got to write stuff down. We already talked about this in the with the previous tip, but breaking things down into smaller tasks. And another big one is making a place or a spot for everything. So always putting things in this, like having a place for everything and always putting the same thing in the same place. So for instance, like me, I used to lose my keys a lot. I had to get one of those little key finder remote things. But now, like every day when I walk in the door, after I lock the door, I just hang my key on the hook. And now, since I do that every day, it's just kind of part of my routine. I never lose my keys anymore. So just something as simple as finding a place for everything or making a place for everything can really help with your organization. You may have to help your student organize their binders or folders or backpacks ever so often to help maybe touch base with the organization. Some individuals need more help than others, so that's just going to be a conversation that you'll need to have at the beginning of the school year and throughout the school year, just to stay on top of the organization piece. So the next strategy is just to have a plan B or a backup plan. So go ahead and think about some areas or some things that have happened in previous school years where a backup plan or a plan B could have been useful. So for instance, falling behind. Go ahead and have a plan for what you or your child could or should do in a situation where they're noticing that they're starting to fall behind. So maybe you want to go ahead and have some certain points in the year where you want to check grades and assignments, kind of see where you are to determine if you are falling behind. And if you see that you are, have a plan for what you're going to do. And that may be reaching out to the teacher or the school counselor to see what you can do, or asking for some extra credit or something like that. Oftentimes students who struggle, sometimes they just feel like if they ignore it, it'll go away, which sometimes presents as work avoidance, like not doing their work. And that can really be harmful for a student, as they're not getting the concepts, and then they're missing a lot of work, which in turn affects their grades. So encourage your child to ask questions when they don't understand something, or when they're becoming frustrated. Or maybe even at the beginning of the year, talk to a teacher or a school counselor about what you should do in those situations. So the next strategy is what I like to call confidence builders. School can be tough for students who struggle with ADHD or, like I said, a learning disorder. So it's really important to incorporate some confidence builders in their schedule. And this may look like just some time to relax, so a time where they're not expected to do anything at that time, or they can choose something to do. Maybe you can give them a list of activities to choose from where they can just relax and wind down. And also just incorporating some fun things for them to do, something they're interested in, maybe a sleepover with a friend, or just a day trip somewhere, or going shopping. So these things will kind of help build their confidence and give them a break from the expectations of school. The next strategy is schedule a time to talk about school. So we're all guilty of, as soon as our student or child gets off the bus, or as soon as they get home from school, asking them questions about school, even if it's just like, how was their day at school, or how did they do on their test. If it's a student who struggles, again, they may not want to talk about that right now. So it's great to set up a time that you and your student agree on, that you know that during that designated time, you'll talk about whatever is going on at school, what's coming up, what you've already done, and just kind of assess where you are and what needs to happen from there. And the last strategy is just allow for space. I want to encourage you to empower your child to take charge and handle some of these things, some of these strategies that we've discussed on their own. Don't do everything for them. It's great to have these conversations, especially before the start of the school year, to talk about some things that could happen and make a plan for those, but really encourage your child to take the lead and just ask for your help when they need it. I hope you'll join us for next week's session, where we talk about how mindfulness can be used to cope with symptoms and behaviors related to ADHD. Thanks for joining today's session, and I hope you'll stay tuned for our upcoming sessions.